Mr. President, in addition to the Arctic, this ministerial, as I mentioned, the eyes of the world are on this. The eyes of the world right now are clearly on the important issue of U.S.-China relations. You had the recent President Trump and President Xi meetings in Mar-a-Lago, and this week, Madame Fu Ying, one of the top Chinese foreign minister officials, is going to be in Washington meeting with a number of us. So it's something that I believe this body needs to focus on more, this important issue, the issue of U.S.-China relations. Mr. President, you know that our country faces a lot of significant challenges, national security challenges around the world. In my view, however, the most significant long-term geostrategic challenge we face, it's not ISIS, it's not Al-Qaeda, it's not Iran, Russia, or even North Korea. These are very serious and immediate concerns. But the most significant long-term challenge we face as a country is the rise of China and the threat it poses to the post-World War II international order led by the United States. This has been made clear in a series of writings by the well-known and respected Harvard professor Graham Allison, beginning 2 years ago in 2015. In an article in the Atlantic magazine, he started to write about what he called the Thucydides trap. Professor Allison is set to publish a book this month on the same topic. And in the book, he writes that the defining question of global order for this generation is whether China and the United States can escape the Thucydides trap. I've had the privilege over the last few weeks of reviewing the book, and I believe it will be a must-read for those who care about the long-term security and economic interests of the United States. So what is he talking about? What is this issue, the Thucydides trap, and why has Professor Allison been so focused on writing about it and addressing it? Well, Thucydides is the famed Greek historian. Many actually view him as the father of all history, who wrote an epic historical work about the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. In that 30-year war, which devastated both of these Greek city-states, the rising power, Athens, challenged the established order of the ruling power, Sparta. The Thucydides trap is the term that Professor Allison describes when he talks about the strategic dilemma and danger that occurs when a rising power threatens a ruling power in the international system. And as his new book explores, in the last 500 years, when this has happened, because it does happen a lot in history, he reviews the last 500 years. Of the 16 times this has happened in the last 500 years, 12 of those times ended up having war, extensive war between the two countries. So that's not good. Those are not great odds. And indeed, in his Atlantic article, just 2 years ago, he concludes by saying because of the seismic shifts and friction that is occurring between China and the U.S., war between these two countries is more likely than recognized at the moment. So that's not good news. But, Mr. President, there is some good news on this, because it's not just Harvard professors who are talking about this. It's not just Professor Allison who's talking about the Thucydides trap. So too are the Chinese. I, with a number of senators, had the opportunity a few years ago when President Xi Jinping visited the Senate to meet with him. And I came down to the Senate floor to talk about some of the issues. some of the ways we need to think about the long-term challenges with regard to the United States and China. And the article in The Atlantic had just come out. So I talked about it, the Thucydides trap, and how we need to avoid it. And then I literally walked into a meeting with the president of China and some other U.S. senators. And in his opening remarks, he talked about the Thucydides trap and how China and the United States need to avoid it. So that's the good news. At least on that issue, we're on the same sheet of paper. There's other good news, and that is that this body, the United States Senate, in many ways is the ideal place where we should be discussing, debating, developing, and yes, implementing the kind of long-term strategic policies that we need to address as a country and develop with regard to the rise of China. In the Federalist Papers, Madison talks about one of the important roles of the U.S. Senate, with its members having 6-year terms and having significant powers in foreign policy, is to be able to ensure a stable and lasting relations between the United States and other nations. Indeed, perhaps more than any other part of the federal government, this institution, the United States Senate, has the opportunity to act and think and debate and implement policies, strategic policies for the long-term interests of our nation. And contrary to some conventional wisdom, where you only hear about American short-termism in terms of long-term foreign policy issues, our country actually has a history of developing long-term strategic frameworks that address significant challenges to American security and economic interests. Just think of the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century, or George Kennan's strategy of containment in the 20th century, dealing with the threat posed by the rise of the Soviet Union and global communism. These were long-term, successful strategies for the United States to significant challenges facing our nation, in part developed here in the United States Senate and implemented here. And we can do it with regard to the challenges we're facing now with China. So as we work with the executive branch on developing an American strategy to address the rise of China and to avoid the Thucydides trap, how should we be thinking about it? What principles should we be focused on? Well, let me suggest 4 that we should be focused on as a nation. First, we must recognize and emphasize that the United States is an Asia-Pacific power. Second, we must strengthen, deepen, and expand our comprehensive alliances in the Asia-Pacific region. Third, we must engage with, not try to contain, China. And fourth, and perhaps most importantly, we must renew America's strength, particularly the economic power and vitality of this great nation. Mr. President, I'd like to turn to each of these principles in a bit more detail. So as I mentioned first, America is an Asia-Pacific power, and we must push back on narratives or counter strategies being developed in the region that talk about Asia for Asians, which are veiled attempts to try to exclude the United States from this dynamic region in the future, in the orders being developed in the Asia-Pacific. But just look at this map. Geographically, we clearly are an Asia-Pacific nation. You know, few of us about a month and a half ago had the opportunity when Prime Minister Abe was visiting to have breakfast with him. And I reminded the Prime Minister at the breakfast that not only are they the key ally of ours in the Asia-Pacific, but for me, as an Alaskan, they're also a neighbor. Just look at this map. I reminded the Prime Minister, my hometown of Anchorage is actually closer to Tokyo than it is to Washington, D.C. And having just gotten off the plane from Anchorage, I can tell you it's a lot closer. And when you think of our forces arrayed, whether in Alaska or Guam or Hawaii, you look at this map, and on U.S. territory, Alaska forces based in my great state are for the most part closer to the Korean Peninsula than forces based in Australia. So we clearly, geographically, are an Asia-Pacific country. And of course, American history has been embedded in the Asia-Pacific for centuries. During World War II, the United States led the effort to win the war in the Pacific after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the bombing of Alaska, which was bombed, invaded, and occupied by the forces of Imperial Japan. Many Americans are not familiar with that history of the war. But it's not just geographic proximity, Mr. President, and the battles that we fought to win World War II in the Asia-Pacific. Just as importantly, in terms of our heritage as an Asia-Pacific nation, is the policies that we implemented after World War II. Because it is now clear that the United States has underwritten the peace, prosperity, and security of this entire region through our continued military presence, our alliances, and our economic engagement and power in the region. No country has done more than the United States to make the Asia-Pacific the world's most dynamic and economically vibrant region, and it's been the policies of our great nation over 70 years that have led to that. And by the way, no country has benefited more from the established order that we put forward and established in this region than China, with the rise of China, in many ways helped, encouraged, moved forward by the peace and prosperity that we brought to the region. Let me provide just one example of how U.S. military forces in the region have played the key role in helping keep the relative peace. Our enduring naval presence has helped to keep the sea lanes where all this transportation and commerce and economic growth has occurred in the Asia-Pacific. That's been the U.S. Navy for decades doing that. As I mentioned, Mr. President, all nations of the region, ours included, have benefited from this order and our policies and our commitment and our sacrifice. All nations, including, and particularly true, China has. So we must flatly and completely reject policies being developed in the region or in Washington that forget our geography and our history. The United States is an Asia-Pacific power. The United States is the preeminent Asia-Pacific power, with many of America's core national interests at stake in the region, and we will be an enduring presence in this part of the world for decades and centuries to come. Second, Mr. President, with regard to how to address the rise of China, the principles we need to think about, we must continue to strengthen, deepen, and expand our comprehensive set of alliances in the Asia-Pacific that have been built over decades. Now, the United States faces many global challenges, but one of the most critical strategic advantages that we have as a nation in terms of security is that we are an ally-rich nation, and our adversaries and potential adversaries and competitors are ally-poor. Just think about it. Look at this map. Look through and think through all the countries that are either treaty allies of the United States or wanting to get closer. And then think of other countries. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, all ally-poor. This is particularly the case in Europe and the Asia-Pacific. As I mentioned, alliance systems built over decades by Democrat and Republican administrations. And what we need to emphasize now is we should not squander that. It is also the case, and we're seeing and hearing about it literally almost every day, whether it's countries like Russia or, yes, China, that are constantly looking for opportunities to create schisms and tensions between the United States and its longstanding allies. We need to resist that. We need to be aware of that. And we need to focus on our allies. As Winston Churchill famously said, the only thing worse than going to war with allies is doing so without them. And with regard to the Asia Pacific, we have an opportunity not just to deepen existing alliances with critical countries like Japan and Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, the Philippines, Thailand. We also have a unique opportunity to expand our alliances in the region of the Asia Pacific, with countries like Vietnam and countries like India. Mr. President, in my first couple of years in the Senate, I've had the opportunity to travel to the region several times. In fact, every time I go home, I travel to the region. And to meet with many of the leaders in the Asia Pacific when they come to Washington or when we're out in the region. And it is clear to me that there is a deep interest in many countries to strengthen their economic and security relationships with the United States. This is driven in part by the role that we have played over decades as the force in the region that has kept the peace and promoted the prosperity. But this is also driven by concerns by almost every country in the region about China's increasingly aggressive actions, particularly in the South China Sea, where despite pledges from senior Chinese leaders not to militarize that part of the world, not to militarize that critical crossroads of commerce for the entire world, they clearly are doing that. And for a country that in many ways is renowned for taking the long view, for having the ability to see around the corners of history, China's actions are having the effect of driving more and more countries into the American sphere. We should seize this opportunity while recognizing that the productive work, the hard work of maintaining our alliances in the region takes time, takes patience, perseverance, respect, and consistency. To be honest, Mr. President, I was a bit concerned, and I gave some speeches last year, that given some of last year's campaign rhetoric, that the Trump administration would not emphasize the importance of our allies and not undertake the hard but necessary work of deepening and expanding key strategic relationships. But I think, to the contrary, they're off to a very good start. The Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, in his first trip overseas as the new Secretary of Defense, could have gone anywhere. NATO, the Middle East, where we have critical strategic interest. He chose to go to Japan and Korea to cement these critical alliances. The Vice President just got back from a 10-day trip to Japan, to Korea, to Australia, Indonesia, with stops in the states representing the Asia Pacific, my home state of Alaska, and Hawaii along the way. I had a good discussion with the Vice President recently over dinner. We talked mostly about this and how focused he and the administration were on maintaining and deepening our alliances in the region. But still, we can always improve, especially in terms of making sure we are coordinating closely with all of our allies on critical decisions and that we keep surprises, especially on sensitive strategic issues, to a minimum with regard to our allies. In this regard, President Trump's recent statement that South Korea would have to pay for the THAAD missile system that we are employing in South Korea after the U.S. had previously stated we would pay, was an unforced error that I hope the administration will be learning from. And of course, this body, the United States Senate, also has an important role to play, not only in emphasizing and helping maintain our alliances by meeting with leaders around the world and working with them, but also in bolstering the capabilities of our partners in the region, economically and militarily. Mr. President, right now there are initiatives that are doing just that, coming out of the Armed Services Committee on which I sit. One is the Asia-Pacific Stability Initiative, led by Senator McCain, which would do that, increase our capabilities with our partners in the region to deepen our alliances. So our alliances clearly matter. They matter in our long-term strategy to address the rise of China, but of course, so does our relationship with China. And that is the third principle I'd like to discuss. We must continue to engage with China, not seek to contain it, as some have argued. In fact, when you look at the U.S. relationship with China, ever since Secretary of State Kissinger and President Nixon in the early 1970s began having discussions with China's leadership, America's policy towards China has always been about engagement. It's never been about containment, like our strategy was with regard to the Soviet Union. Now, of course, it's taken different forms. You had the One China policy, which we're still focused on. The Taiwan Relations Act, which was developed by this body in the United States Senate in the late 70s. You had recently initiated by President Bush and continued by President Obama the Strategic Economic Dialogue, where senior leaders in the United States and China met every 6 months. I had the opportunity to participate in that as an Assistant Secretary of State under Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. So there's all kinds of different approaches to our engagement. The most strategic concept, in my view, Mr. President, since the One China policy was the policy developed during the Bush administration by former Deputy Secretary of State Bob Zoellick, who went on to be the president of the World Bank. What he called the responsible stakeholder model. It was very well received initially in 2006. He laid it out in a big speech, then went to China, focused on this. And essentially the essence of that strategy was China has greatly benefited from the U.S.-led international order, from the U.S.-led international system. And therefore, it is in China's interest to become a responsible stakeholder in that system, to strengthen the international system that has so greatly enabled its own economic success. Now, in the early days of this strategy, when it was launched, there was a lot of promise. I remember having the opportunity of going over to China with Secretary Paulson when he was leading the Strategic Economic Dialogue in the Bush administration. We would meet with all the leadership of China, from the president on down. And at that time, every leader in these meetings used the term responsible stakeholder. They talked about it. They talked about this American concept as a framework for our relationship. But unfortunately, Mr. President, it doesn't seem to be working out so well now. Chinese officials no longer talk about being a responsible stakeholder. In fact, on many military and economic issues, they seem focused on undermining the U.S.-led international order. Professor Allison's book mentions this specifically, where he says an increasingly powerful China is unraveling the American-led order, throwing into question the peace that generations in the region have taken for granted. Now, Mr. President, when you look at the long arch of history with regard to China, this notion that maybe they wouldn't accept this idea of becoming a responsible stakeholder in our system that we created, well, that might not happen. And indeed, this was foretold by one of the wisest men in Asia, Lee Kuan Yew, who was the father of Singapore, decade after decade, as he built that country into an economic powerhouse. American leaders, military leaders, political leaders, presidents, Democrats, Republicans would meet with Lee Kuan Yew to get his advice and wisdom. I had the opportunity as a young National Security Council staffer to be invited to a meeting with Lee Kuan Yew when I was in Singapore. It was one of the most interesting meetings of my career, with Deputy Secretary Bob Zoellick and our ambassador. Lee Kuan Yew talked about Asia, talked about America's role for 2 hours. But in a book, another book about Lee Kuan Yew by Professor Allison, he was asked about whether China would accept this idea of being a responsible stakeholder in the American-led international order. His answer was, quote, "Of course not. Why not? How could they aspire not to be number one in Asia and in time number one in the world?" When asked about this concept of being a responsible stakeholder in this system that's benefited them, Lee Kuan Yew was complimentary of the concept that the Americans are trying to lay out. But he said China wants to be China, and as such, not an honorary member of the West and their international system. So even though it is clear that the responsible stakeholder framework is not working with China, we still need to stay engaged at all levels: senior leaders, economic officials, military leaders. And I want to compliment the President on how he started the relationship with President Xi Jinping. They seem to be off to a good start. But at the same time, we need to continue to look at different concepts, a different framework of how we continue to engage with China. Mr. President, let me suggest one idea, what I've termed true reciprocity. As China has rejected the responsible stakeholder model, it is also clear that they are increasingly rejecting the idea of a reciprocal relationship with the United States across a number of sectors. Let me just give you a couple examples. You look at issues like intellectual property theft. The United States has been raising this issue for decades. Matter of fact, I had the opportunity to sit in a meeting with former President Bush, Condoleezza Rice, senior Chinese officials in the Oval Office. We talked about this issue. The President pounded the table on this issue. The Chinese committed to not stealing our intellectual property. And yet that continues unabated, now often through cyber attacks. You look at foreign direct investment, how Chinese companies invest in Europe and the United States, how they're buying companies such as advanced robotics, biotech, media, high-tech companies, internet companies. But if an American company or a Western European company wanted to do the same in China, we know what the answer would be. It would be no. And this lack of economic reciprocity extends beyond the trading relationship. I attended a briefing a few weeks ago in the Senate by the Asia Society, which is putting out an important strategy document with regard to China. Ideas for the Trump administration, a very thoughtful policy recommendation piece. One thing they noted that in terms of even diplomacy, right now in Beijing, our U.S. ambassador is typically only getting deputy minister level access, deputy minister level meetings. While back here, we give much higher access to ministers, to the Secretary of State. This was essentially confirmed by former President Obama's own ambassador, former Senator Max Baucus, who in a remarkable exit interview about his time as ambassador to China, a job that he loved, he talked about how in many ways, in terms of reciprocity, we were too weak, not firm enough, pushed around. These are his quotes. An interview that actually didn't make a lot of news, but was quite remarkable. How we had no strategy to deal with this. How we needed to draw our own red lines. So as we develop a long-term strategy towards China to avoid the Thucydides trap, we need to institute an engagement policy that looks at true reciprocity. Mr. President, I'll be speaking about this more in the coming weeks, where I'm going to be offering legislation with regard to reciprocity in the economic and trade relationship. But I will say, diplomatically speaking, this should be a no-brainer. If our ambassador in Beijing only gets deputy minister level access to Chinese officials in China's capital, then that's what we should provide China's ambassador here. Simple, easy. Mr. President, the final principle we need to focus on in developing our long-term strategy to address the rise of China is the imperative to renew America's strength, particularly the economic power and vitality of the United States. We have to be strong at home again, and we haven't been. I have a chart here that says it all. Over the last really 10 to 15 years, we've had a lost decade of economic growth. We have not been able to hit 3% GDP growth in almost 15 years. Now, some have called this the new normal, but this is what we should expect. But in many ways, when you look at this chart, Republican, Democratic administration, the 3% line here, it's not a great number. It's an okay number. The traditional levels of economic growth are closer to 4% for our country. But literally almost for 15 years, we haven't hit it. Not once. President Obama was the first president where we've never hit 3% GDP growth in a year, ever. This is not a healthy economy. And in many ways, people are starting to question the American dream, the idea that each generation will do better. We have to get back to a strong economy. I certainly hope the Trump administration will be focusing on this. I know that many members of this body are focused on this issue. Last quarter, we didn't have a good start with the new administration. 0.7% GDP growth, less than 1% growth. Economic growth, even more than military might, in many ways is the coin of the realm in Asia. We must get back to a robust economy. Now, many experts at home and abroad say we can't do it, say our demographic challenges are too great. But, Mr. President, I disagree. If you look at U.S. history, every time we are dismissed, every time someone talks about the decline of the great American engine of growth, whether in the 1930s or the 1970s, or beginning in the 1980s, when Japan was going to overtake us. Every time that happens, and the naysayers are out there, the United States economy comes roaring back. It's critical that we do this now. We have so many strategic advantages, even relative to China, with regard to our economy. So many of our challenges, in my view, are self-inflicted problems that we can solve. Strong economic growth, at least above 3%, will more closely bind our allies to the United States and the Asia-Pacific region. Strong economic growth will help us rebuild our military, which has been drastically cut over the last 8 years. Strong economic growth will be critical to tackling our challenges at home, such as skyrocketing deficits and debt levels and crumbling infrastructure. And perhaps most importantly, strong economic growth will enable us to view the future, including the rise of China, with confidence and not fear. Our great nation succeeds when we look to the future as an opportunity, not with trepidation. In Professor Allison's upcoming book, currently titled Destined for War, America, China, and the Thucydides Trap, he notes that fear was the driving force that propelled Athens and Sparta into the Peloponnesian War. Quote, what made war inevitable, Thucydides tells us, was the rise of Athens and the fear this instilled in Sparta. In the 12 of 16 cases he reviews in his book where a rising power challenged an established power, leading to war, fear was a key driving force that often precipitated war. The more our policies at home can renew America's strength, vitality, and confidence, the more likely, in my view, that we will develop clear, long-term foreign policies that can help us avoid the Thucydides trap. Mr. President, I've had the opportunity in my career to view the U.S.-China relationship over the past 2 decades from a variety of different lenses and perspectives. Over 20 years ago, I was deployed as a young Marine infantry officer as part of an amphibious task force to what later became known as the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis, defending U.S. interests in the region and those of our ally Taiwan. Later, I was an NSC staffer and an Assistant Secretary of State under Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and spent a lot of time in China working on these issues. I became a State of Alaska official, traveling from my state as the Commissioner of Natural Resources and Energy, traveling to China to pursue the promise of better economic relations. China is now the #1 market for my very export-oriented state for Alaska exports. And now as a U.S. Senator, focused on this issue, co-chairing the U.S.-China Working Group with my good friend Senator Daines, and getting out to the region as often as possible. I've seen the promise and opportunity and challenges of the U.S.-China relationship as it has matured over the last 20 years. And I have deep respect for China and its history and all that it has recently accomplished, and know some of the leaders over there and consider them colleagues. This body, the U.S. Senate, our country, we need to do more to focus on how to make sure that the rise of China is compatible with U.S. economic and national security interests, and most importantly, with the interest of the people we represent. I've laid out some core principles this evening on how we might begin to develop a coherent long-term strategy in addressing the challenges and opportunities of China's rise. I hope my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans in this body, all of us will work together over the years on this incredibly important issue. There is so much at stake and a lot of work to do by many in the government, in the private sector, in the military, both in the United States, in China, and in countries in the region. The gravitational pull of history might be working against us. There's a lot riding on how we address this preeminent geostrategic issue. Let me conclude by reading how Professor Allison in his book sums up the challenge. He states, quote, the return to prominence of a 5,000-year-old civilization with 1.4 billion people is not a problem to be fixed. It is a condition, a chronic condition that will have to be managed over a generation. Success will require not just a new slogan, more frequent presidential summits, or additional meetings of departmental working groups. Managing this relationship over the course of years and decades without war will demand sustained attention, week by week at the highest levels in both governments. It will require a depth of mutual understanding not seen since the Henry Kissinger, Zhou Enlai conversations that reestablished U.S.-China relations in the 1970s. Most significantly, it will mean more radical changes in attitudes and actions by leaders and the public alike than anyone yet has undertaken. To escape the Thucydides trap, we must be willing to think the unthinkable and imagine the unimaginable. Avoiding the Thucydides trap, in this case, will require nothing less than bending the arc of history. I yield the floor.